$52,000. The doctor's words were cold sterile, just like the hospital room where I lay. They hung in the air between me and my wife Eleanor, heavier than any physical weight I had ever known. The fall had been quick. One moment I was on the roof, a proud 76-year-old man fixing his own home. The next, I was on the ground, the world a dizzying blur of pain and blue sky. But the true impact wasn't the shattered hip. It was this number, this impossible sum that Medicare would barely touch. I looked at Eleanor. Her hand trembled as she held mine, her face a mask of love and fear. For nearly 50 years we had faced everything together, but this felt different. This felt like an end. As if on cue, Eleanor's phone buzzed. It was our son David. His voice on the speakerphone was strained, desperate. His architectural firm was failing. He was on the verge of losing everything. Another crushing blow, another life we had built now crumbling. Suddenly my mind wasn't in that cold hospital room anymore. I was back home on Willow Creek Lane in the house I built with my own two hands. I could almost feel the worn wood of the porch swing where Eleanor and I had spent countless summer evenings. I could see the pencil marks on the kitchen door frame charting David's growth from a small boy into a man. I could smell the sweet scent of Eleanor's peach cobbler, a scent that meant safety, a scent that meant love. That house wasn't just wood and nails. It was the museum of our lives, the keeper of our memories, the very heart of our family. And as the doctor's words echoed in my ears, a terrible, heartbreaking realization began to dawn. That heart would have to be sacrificed. We had spent a lifetime building a sanctuary for our son. Now, to save him, we would have to tear it down. We drove home from the hospital in a silence so thick it felt like I could barely breathe. The familiar comforts of our kitchen, usually a source of warmth and peace, offered no solace that night. Eleanor made us some tea, her movements slow and deliberate, as if every small action required immense effort. We sat at the old oak table, the same one where we had shared thousands of meals, celebrated birthdays, and helped David with his homework. Tonight it felt like a stranger's table. I watched a single tear trace a path down Eleanor's weary cheek, and my heart, which I thought couldn't possibly break any further, fractured all over again. I reached across the table and took her hand. My own was calloused and rough from a lifetime of work, while hers was soft yet strong. It was the hand that had held our son for the first time, the hand that had tended our garden, the hand that had held me together for 50 years. She finally looked at me, her eyes reflecting the deep, unspoken understanding that had always existed between us. "We have to, don't we, Sam?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator. The words hung in the air, a final, terrible confirmation of the thought that had been screaming in my mind for hours. I couldn't form a sentence. All I could do was nod, a slow, heavy movement that felt like it was sealing our fate. We didn't need to say the words. We were going to sell the house, our home. We were going to give up our past to save our son's future. The days that followed were a blur of painful necessities. A real estate agent, a kind woman with a bright professional smile, came and spoke of market values and curb appeal. Her cheerful words felt like a violation in the quiet grief of our home. Then came the sign. I watched from the living room window as a young man hammered it into our front lawn. For sale. The letters were bold and red. To me, it looked like a tombstone marking the death of the life we had known. The open houses were the worst part. We would leave for hours at a time, sitting in a nearby park like displaced persons while strangers paraded through our home. They walked on our floors, opened our closets, peered into the private corners of our life. I imagined them commenting on the wallpaper Eleanor had chosen so carefully, or the scuff marks on the floor from when David used to ride his tricycle indoors. They weren't seeing a home filled with love and memories. They were seeing an asset, a property, a collection of rooms and features to be assessed and valued. Each time we returned, the house felt a little less like ours, as if the presence of all those strangers had slowly erased our essence from the walls. Finally, the day came when the house was sold. The movers had taken what little we could keep, leaving the rooms cavernous and empty. Before we left for the last time, Eleanor and I walked through it one more time. The silence was deafening, amplifying the sound of our own footsteps on the bare hardwood floors. In the kitchen, Eleanor stopped at the doorframe and gently traced her fingers over a series of faded pencil marks. "Remember how excited he was when he finally got taller than me?" she said softly, a ghost of a smile on her lips. I saw it too, a quick flash of a laughing 10-year-old David puffing out his chest with pride. In the living room, I placed my hand on the cool, rough stone of the fireplace I had built myself. For a second, I could almost hear the crackle of a fire and the sounds of Christmas morning of wrapping paper being torn and joyous laughter filling the air. We walked out to the backyard and looked at the old oak tree. The tire swing was long gone, but I could still see our son soaring through the air, his shouts of "Higher, Dad, higher" echoing in my memory. The house wasn't empty at all. It was filled with the ghosts of a beautiful life, and leaving them behind was the hardest thing I'd ever had to do. The new owners were a young couple with a small child, their faces full of the same hope and excitement we once had. They were kind, but I could barely look at them. I pressed the old brass key into the young man's hand. It felt cold, foreign, no longer a part of me. He smiled, thanked us, and gently closed the door. That quiet click was the sound of a 47-year chapter of our lives ending forever. David drove us to his home in a newer part of Charlotte, a neighborhood where every house looked almost identical, distinguished only by the color of its front door. His car was expensive and quiet, gliding over the smooth pavement. It was a world away from the familiar bumpy roads of our old neighborhood. His house was what Monique called a modern masterpiece. It was all clean lines, large glass windows, and shades of gray and white. It was beautiful, I suppose, in the way a magazine photo is beautiful. But it was a cold beauty. There was no history in its perfectly smooth walls, no character in its minimalist furniture. Our old home had been filled with the comfortable clutter of a life well lived. This house was filled with empty space. Our new living quarters were in the finished basement. It was a large open room with a television the size of a small car and a sleek leather sofa that converted into a bed. Our few boxes of belongings looked small and out of place in the vastness of the room. David and Monique had tried to make it comfortable, but it wasn't a bedroom. It was a temporary space, and we felt like temporary people. Still, we were grateful. We were with family, and we told ourselves that was all that mattered. For the first few weeks, it felt like we had made the right decision. It was almost like a honeymoon period. We fell into a comfortable rhythm. Eleanor, unable to sit still, took over most of the cooking. The house was soon filled with the familiar, comforting smells of her pot roast and freshly baked bread. David had never lost his love for his mother's cooking, and he seemed genuinely happy to have her there. I made myself useful by fixing things. A leaky faucet in the guest bathroom, a wobbly leg on a dining room chair, the squeaky hinge on the back door. It felt good to have a purpose to contribute in some small way. The best part was the time with our grandchildren, Jamal and Keisha. With Eleanor and me there to look after them, they seemed to bloom. I would spend hours in the backyard with Jamal, teaching him how to properly throw a baseball. He was a natural, his face lighting up with pure joy every time he made a good catch. Eleanor would sit with Keisha on the patio, patiently teaching her how to braid their heads bent together in quiet concentration. In those moments, it was easy to forget what we had lost. We were a family all under one roof, and a fragile sense of hope began to grow in my heart. Maybe this wasn't an end, but a new beginning. I saw the relief in David's eyes and believed that our sacrifice had been worth it. But then, little things started to happen. The changes were subtle at first. Small comments dropped so casually you could almost miss their sting. It started with Monique in the kitchen. One evening, as Eleanor was adding a generous knob of butter to a pan of mashed potatoes, Monique walked in. "Oh, Mom, that's an awful lot of butter," she said with a light, airy laugh. "We're trying to watch our cholesterol. It's not good for Dad's heart, you know." She said it with a smile as if she were sharing a helpful tip, but Eleanor's hand faltered. The next day, a tub of low-fat artificial butter substitute appeared in the refrigerator. A week later, Monique decided the living room needed a new look. "I think we should rearrange the furniture a little just to open up the space and create a better flow," she announced one Saturday morning. The "we," of course, meant me and David. We spent the afternoon moving heavy furniture according to her precise instructions. My favorite armchair, the one I had brought from our old house, was moved from its comfortable spot by the window to a dark, unused corner of the room. When I tried to protest gently, she just smiled and said, "Oh, Dad, it looks so much more stylish this way, don't you think?" Her words were always framed as suggestions, her opinions presented as undeniable facts. They were not invitations for discussion. They were quiet, polite commands, and we were expected to obey. The fragile hope we had nurtured in those first few weeks began to wither like a plant deprived of sunlight. Monique's subtle comments about butter and furniture placement were not isolated incidents. They were the opening moves in a quiet, methodical campaign to reshape the household in her image, a campaign in which our comfort, our history, and our feelings were apparently insignificant. The process was so gradual, so cleverly disguised in the language of modern living and good taste, that to protest felt like you were being unreasonable, old-fashioned, and difficult. And so for a time we said nothing. We just watched as our presence in the house was slowly, systematically erased. The first major casualty was my armchair. It was an old brown leather chair that had molded itself to the shape of my body over 20 years. It was the chair where I had read hundreds of books, the chair where I had held both Jamal and Keisha as newborns, humming them to sleep. It was more than a piece of furniture. It was an old friend. One afternoon I came home from a walk to find a new chair in its place. It was a stark white angular thing that looked like it belonged in a museum lobby. It was stylish, I suppose, but it offered no comfort, no welcome. I found my old friend down in the basement, pushed into a dark corner next to the water heater. It looked forlorn and abandoned. When Monique came down to announce dinner, I asked her about it. "The new chair is nice, Monique, but what's wrong with the old one?" She gave me a patient smile, the kind one might give to a confused child. "Oh, Dad, the leather on that one was so cracked and dated. This one is Italian. It just completely elevates the room." I wanted to tell her that the cracks in that leather were the roadmap of our family's life, but I knew it would be pointless. The next evening, I tried to sit in the new white chair to read. The angles were all wrong, forcing my back into an unnatural position. It was a chair made for looking at, not for living in. A few weeks later, it was our family photos. The long hallway upstairs had been our personal gallery. There was a photo of me and Eleanor on our wedding day, a picture of a 3-year-old David with chocolate smeared all over his face, school portraits, and candid snapshots from family vacations. One day, they were all gone. The wall was now a sterile white, adorned with 3 large, identical black frames containing abstract prints of gray and blue lines. When I asked Monique where the photos had gone, she said brightly, "I found a much better place for them." She led me to the garage and pointed to a large plastic storage bin. "They'll be so much safer in here, protected from the sunlight." My heart sank. Our entire history, our legacy was now packed away in a dark box deemed too cluttered and sentimental for the modern aesthetic of her home. The takeover of our space was followed by a takeover of our time. Monique established a rigid set of rules that governed the rhythm of our daily lives. Dinner was served at 6:30 in the evening, not a minute sooner or later. The meals themselves changed too. Eleanor's comforting, soulful cooking was replaced by Monique's bland, health-conscious recipes. Quinoa salads, steamed vegetables, and grilled chicken breast with no seasoning. Eleanor tried to help in the kitchen, but Monique would gently correct her, telling her she was using too much salt or the wrong kind of oil. Defeated Eleanor slowly retreated, spending more time in the basement. I watched as the joy she once found in feeding her family was quietly extinguished. Evenings became a source of quiet frustration. After dinner, I used to enjoy watching old black and white movies on television, but the large screen in the living room was now permanently tuned to a 24-hour business news channel. The endless scrolling stock tickers and talking heads discussing market fluctuations became the grating soundtrack to our nights. "It's important for David to stay informed about the economy," Monique would say, as if that settled the matter. Our simple pleasures were irrelevant. Through all of this, I kept looking to David, waiting for him to notice, to say something to defend us. But my son had become a master of avoidance. He would come home from work, give us a tired hello, and then disappear into his home office. One Saturday, I finally managed to get him alone in the garage while he was looking for a tool. I decided to speak plainly. "David," I started, my voice quiet but firm. "Your mother isn't happy. Monique has changed everything. The photos, my chair, she's taken over the whole house. It doesn't feel like we're welcome here." David wouldn't meet my eyes. He busied himself organizing a set of wrenches on the pegboard. "Dad, come on," he mumbled, his back still to me. "Monique is just trying to make the house nice for everyone. You know how she is about things having to be perfect." He turned finally, but his eyes were pleading. "Please, just don't make a big deal out of it. Things are so stressful with my business right now, I just need peace at home." And there it was. His peace was more important than our comfort. His desire to avoid conflict with his wife was stronger than his duty to his parents. In that moment, I understood. We had not moved in with our son. We had moved into Monique's house, and we were living by her rules. And our own son was not our ally. He was her silent, complicit partner. Having successfully conquered the physical space of the house, Monique turned her attention to the one thing we cherished most, our time with Jamal and Keisha. Her methods, as always, were cloaked in the impeccable logic of modern parenting. She claimed she was investing in the children's future, giving them every possible advantage in a competitive world. To us, it felt like she was building a wall brick by brick between us and our grandchildren. It began one Sunday evening when Monique unveiled a large color-coded weekly schedule and stuck it to the stainless steel refrigerator. Each day was a mosaic of different activities. Monday was piano lessons. Tuesday was soccer practice for Jamal and ballet for Keisha. Wednesday was coding club. Thursday was French tutoring. Friday was swimming. "It's amazing, isn't it?" she said, her voice beaming with pride. "We have to ensure they are well-rounded. This is what it takes to get into a good college these days." David nodded in agreement, looking impressed. Eleanor and I just stared at the chart. We saw a schedule so tightly packed, there was barely any room for a child to simply be a child. More importantly, we saw a schedule with no room for us. Our afternoons, once filled with the joy of picking the kids up from school, sharing stories over milk and cookies, and helping with homework, were now empty. A paid service now drove the children from school to their various activities, and they often wouldn't get home until just before dinner. The rhythm of our lives changed dramatically. The afternoons grew long and silent. The quiet of the house was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, filled with an aching sense of absence. We would wait, listening for the sound of the garage door opening, a sign that the children were finally home. But their return brought little comfort. They would stumble in weary from their long day, their backpacks heavy on their small shoulders. Dinner, which Monique insisted be served precisely at 6:30, became a hurried and silent affair. The children were often too exhausted to talk, their faces buried in their iPads or phones, which Monique allowed, saying they needed time to decompress. I tried to break through the wall. One evening, I asked Jamal about his soccer practice. He gave a one-word answer, "Fine," without looking up from his screen. The easy, flowing conversations we once had were gone, replaced by a strained formality. The final blow was the end of our bedtime story ritual. For years, Eleanor or I would read a chapter from a book to the children before they slept. It was our most precious time together. One night, as Eleanor picked up a book, Monique stopped her at the bottom of the stairs. "Oh, Mom, you don't need to do that anymore," she said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "They're getting too old for that. Besides, they need to get to sleep right away. They have such a busy day tomorrow." Eleanor just stood there, the book held tightly in her hands. She didn't argue. She just turned and walked slowly back down to the basement. I saw the light in her eyes dim that night, and I don't think it ever fully returned. We were being pushed to the margins, but the most painful moments were when we realized we had been pushed out entirely. One crisp Saturday morning in October, Eleanor and I woke up to an unusually quiet house. We came up from the basement to find the kitchen empty. A single hastily scribbled note was left on the counter. It read, "Took the kids to the county fall festival. Back late tonight. There are leftovers in the fridge." I read the note twice, the words blurring in front of my eyes. The fall festival. We had taken David to that same festival every single year when he was a boy. We had been looking forward to taking Jamal and Keisha. The feeling that washed over me was cold and sharp. We hadn't just been overlooked. We had been deliberately left behind. An oversight is forgetting to mention a plan. This was a conscious decision to execute a plan without us. We spent the day in that large, silent house feeling more like ghosts than family members. When they returned late that night, flushed from the cold and laden with pumpkins and caramel apples, Monique offered a breezy, insincere apology. "Oh my gosh, I am so sorry," she said, not sounding sorry at all. "It was all so last minute, I completely forgot to tell you." "You probably would have found it all a bit boring and crowded anyway." David stood behind her, his hands in his pockets, refusing to meet my gaze. He said nothing. His silence was his answer. It was his consent. That day, I finally understood our true place in this house. We were not family. We were occupants, burdens to be managed, inconvenient reminders of a past that no longer fit into their perfect modern life. The wall Monique had built around the children was now complete. Having successfully isolated us, she began the final phase of her campaign. This phase was quieter, more insidious, and far more cruel. It was a psychological war, fought not with loud arguments, but with whispers, feigned concern, and carefully planted seeds of doubt. Her goal was no longer just to control the space around us, but to control the space within our own minds. She wanted us to believe that we were failing, that we were incompetent, that we were a danger to ourselves and to the family we so deeply loved. She wanted us to doubt our own sanity, and to my eternal shame and horror, she nearly succeeded. The turning point was the incident with the gas stove. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was in the basement organizing my small toolbox, and Eleanor was in the kitchen making herself a cup of tea. I heard the faint click of the stove igniting and then clicking off. A few minutes later, Monique came home. I heard her footsteps on the floor above me, then a dramatic theatrical gasp. "Oh my goodness, do you smell that?" she called out, her voice laced with panic. "It's gas. The whole kitchen smells like gas." I hurried up the stairs to see Monique making a great show of fanning the air with a dish towel while rushing to the stove. She twisted one of the knobs, which was already in the off position, and then turned to Eleanor with wide, alarmed eyes. "Mom, you left the gas on again," she said, her voice dripping with a mixture of false sympathy and accusation. Eleanor, who was sitting at the table with her cup of tea, looked utterly bewildered. "Monique." "I did no such thing," she said firmly. "I am absolutely certain I turned it off completely." Monique just shook her head sadly. "It's okay, Mom, really. These things happen when we get older. I'm just glad I came home when I did." She let the words hang in the air, a poisonous cloud of insinuation. Eleanor was shaken. But I knew my wife. She was meticulous. She would never make a mistake like that. This was a lie, a performance designed for an audience that was not yet present. That audience arrived when David came home. I was in the basement, but their voices carried down the open stairwell. I heard Monique speaking in a low, urgent whisper, the kind designed to convey immense gravity and concern. "David, we need to talk." "I'm so worried about your mother," she began. "She left the gas stove on for at least 20 minutes this afternoon. The whole house could have blown up. What if Jamal and Keisha had been home alone? Her memory, it's really starting to fail." I heard David sigh, the sound of a man weary from work and unwilling to face another problem. "Are you sure?" he asked, but his voice lacked conviction. "Of course I'm sure," Monique pressed on, her voice rising with manufactured emotion. "I love your mother, you know I do, but we have to be realistic. She's becoming a danger." That single fabricated event became the justification for everything that followed. A few days later, Monique approached us with a new proposal. "With everything on your minds," she began, her tone gentle and considerate, "I was thinking I could help take one little thing off your plate. Why don't I start collecting the mail for you and help you sort through your bills? It's so easy to misplace things or forget a due date. I just want to make sure you have nothing to worry about." It was a brilliant move. The offer was wrapped in the language of love and support. But I saw it for what it was, a clear attempt to gain control over our finances, our last bastion of independence. I wanted to refuse to tell her we were perfectly capable of managing our own affairs. But I looked at Eleanor, who was still rattled by the gas stove accusation, and I saw the flicker of doubt in her eyes. David, already convinced of his mother's failing memory, immediately endorsed the idea. "That's a fantastic idea, honey. It would give us all some peace of mind." We were trapped. To refuse would be to seem ungrateful and paranoid. We reluctantly agreed, and just like that, another piece of our autonomy was stripped away. The small daily attacks became relentless. They were like the steady drip of water on a stone designed to wear us down over time. If I picked up my car keys, Monique would say, "Oh, Dad, you seem a little tired today. Are you sure you feel up to driving? I can take you wherever you need to go." When Eleanor would pause in the middle of a story to find the right word, Monique would quickly jump in and finish the sentence for her, later telling David, "Your mom is having more and more trouble finding her words." She would move our reading glasses or the television remote from where we always kept them, and then watch with feigned innocence as we searched for them, only to find them for us in an obvious place. See, her expression would say, "You're so forgetful." It was a constant, subtle assault on our confidence, a campaign to make us feel old, useless, and utterly dependent on her. And the most terrifying part was that it was starting to work. Sleep had become a stranger to me. Most nights I would lie awake in the darkness of the basement, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house, my mind churning with a low-level hum of anxiety and resentment. But this night was different. A profound sense of dread had settled deep in my bones, a chilling premonition that something was deeply wrong. After hours of staring at the ceiling, a dry thirst compelled me to move. I slipped out of the sofa bed, careful not to wake Eleanor. Her breathing was soft and even, a small island of peace in my turbulent world. I made my way up the carpeted stairs, my bare feet silent in the sleeping house. The main floor was bathed in the pale, ghostly light of the moon streaming through the large picture windows. The modern furniture cast long, distorted shadows across the floor, making the space feel alien and menacing. In the kitchen, the only sound was the low, steady hum of the expensive refrigerator. I took a glass from the cupboard, the smooth, cool surface, a small, solid comfort in my hand. As the water flowed from the tap, I heard it, a low murmur of voices from down the hall. It was David and Monique talking in their bedroom. The door must have been left slightly ajar, their hushed tones carrying through the silent house. I turned off the water, my hand frozen in midair. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but something in Monique's voice, a sharp, insistent edge, held me captive. I stood motionless in the shadows, a silent intruder in my own son's home. At first, I could only catch a few words: worry and responsibility and your mother. Then Monique's voice grew clearer, and the words began to crystallize into a monstrous shape. This isn't cruel. David, it's practical, she said, her voice devoid of any emotion. It was the calm, rational tone of a business executive discussing a difficult but necessary merger. We can't go on like this. The incident with the stove was a warning. She is becoming a liability. We have to protect them from themselves, and more importantly, we have to protect our family, our children. I heard David murmur something indistinct, a weak protest. But Monique cut him off, her voice sharp and decisive. The first step is getting power of attorney. It's a simple legal process. It will allow us to manage their finances, the money from the house sale, their pensions, their social security. It all needs to be managed properly by someone with a clear head. Their finances will finally be secure. With us. My blood ran cold. This was what the offers to help the concerns about the mail had all been leading to. It was a calculated seizure of our independence. But she wasn't finished. And once that's settled, she continued, her voice softening into a tone of false reason. We can find them a nice assisted living facility. I've already been researching a few. There's a lovely place over in Hendersonville. It has gardens, social activities, professional care around the clock. They would be with people their own age. They would be safe. We would know they are being looked after properly. I could hear the flimsy threads of my son's resistance begin to tear. A nursing home. Monique, he asked, his voice sounding small and defeated. They would hate that. It would break their hearts. It's not a nursing home, David. It's a community, Monique corrected him smoothly. And would they hate it more than accidentally burning this house down? Would they hate it more than being a constant source of stress and worry for you? I see the toll this is taking on you. This is the only logical solution. It's the responsible thing to do for everyone. There was a long pause. I held my breath, praying, pleading silently for my son to find his strength to be the man I had raised him to be. Then I heard his voice, a weary sigh of surrender that shattered the last remnants of my hope. Okay, he said the word, a barely audible breath. Okay, Monique, maybe you're right. He paused again and then delivered the final fatal blow. Let me look into it. The glass in my hand began to tremble, the cold water sloshing over my fingers, but I barely felt it. A roaring sound filled my ears, drowning out the hum of the refrigerator. It was the sound of my own heart breaking. My son, the boy whose every need I had put before my own, the man for whom I had sacrificed the home I had built and the life I had known. That man had just agreed to strip us of our freedom, to take control of our money, and to put us away in an institution until we died. He was not just a silent partner in Monique's cruelty anymore. He was an active conspirator. I didn't make a sound. With a hand that felt disconnected from my own body, I carefully placed the glass on the granite countertop. I turned and walked back toward the basement, each step a monumental effort. I was a soldier retreating from a battle I had not even known. I was fighting a battle that had been lost before I even understood the stakes. I was walking away from my son and from the man I once believed him to be. I stood in the darkness of the basement for what felt like an eternity, the overheard words echoing in my mind, each one a separate poisoned dart. Power of attorney. A facility. My son's weak, compliant voice agreeing to it all. The initial shock that had frozen me in place began to thaw, replaced by a cold, clear resolve. The time for silent suffering, for hoping things would get better, was over. Monique had drawn a line and she had shown us exactly where we stood. Now we had to draw our own. I walked over to the sofa bed where Eleanor was sleeping peacefully, her face soft in the faint moonlight filtering through the small basement window. I hated to wake her to pull her from a peaceful dream into the nightmare our life had become. But we were out of time. I gently touched her shoulder. "Eleanor," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "Wake up." She stirred, her eyes fluttering open with the soft confusion of someone pulled from deep sleep. "Sam, what is it? What's wrong?" she murmured, trying to sit up. I knelt beside the bed, my hand still on her shoulder, and I delivered the devastating truth as simply and directly as I could. There was no way to soften this blow. I overheard them. I said, my voice barely a tremor. "Monique and David. They are going to put us in a home. They want power of attorney." I said the words plainly, letting their full, terrible weight settle in the silent room. I watched as a wave of emotions washed over my wife's face. First, the lingering sleepiness gave way to complete, alert confusion. Her brow furrowed as she tried to make sense of my words. Then, as the meaning sank in, her eyes widened with a sudden sharp fear. I saw her breath catch in her throat, her hand coming up to her mouth. It was a look of pure gut-wrenching horror, the look of a mother realizing the depth of her child's betrayal. I braced myself for tears, for a breakdown that she was more than entitled to have, but it never came. Instead, something remarkable happened. The fear in her eyes flickered for a moment and then was extinguished, replaced by a fire I had not seen in years. It was the same fire I saw when a doctor once gave a grim prognosis for a young David, the same fire I saw when we nearly lost our first home to a bank error. It was the look of a woman who would not be broken. Her back straightened, her chin lifted, and her gaze met mine with an unwavering, steely resolve. In that silent, shared look, a pact was formed. We didn't need to discuss our pain or our anger. We didn't need to cry. We understood each other completely. The time for being victims was over. The time for fighting back had begun. She swung her legs out of bed, her movements now filled with a quiet, urgent energy. "How much cash do we have?" she asked, her voice a low, steady whisper. There was no panic, only focus. We had become a council of war, two generals planning a critical escape from behind enemy lines. "I have about $300 hidden in my toolbox," I replied. "And I have nearly $200 in my purse, in the little blue envelope," she added. "The social security cards are birth certificates." "Where are they?" I asked. "In the old photo album, the one Monique put in the garage." "I'll get them," she said without hesitation. Our planning was swift, efficient, and spoken in hushed tones. We would pack only what we could carry in 2 small duffel bags. We would take our essential documents, all the cash we had, and a few changes of clothes. "The intercity bus station on North Tryon Street," I said. "The first bus leaves at 5:30 in the morning heading north." Eleanor nodded. "Then we leave at 3. Long before any of them are awake." The plan was desperate, it was terrifying, but it was ours. It was the first decision we had made for ourselves, the first ounce of control we had taken back since selling our home. As we moved silently around the dark basement, gathering our few precious items, a strange sense of calm settled over me. This was not the act of 2 feeble old people running away in fear. This was an act of defiance. It was a declaration that our lives, our minds, and our dignity were still our own, and they were not for sale. The silent vibration of my old wristwatch was what woke me precisely at 3 in the morning. For a moment, tangled in the unfamiliar sofa bed sheets, I was disoriented. Then the cold, hard reality of our situation rushed back in. This was it. This was the night. Beside me, Eleanor was already awake, her eyes open and alert in the dim light. We didn't speak. We had said everything that needed to be said in the silent pact we made hours earlier. Now it was time for action. We moved in the darkness with a shared silent purpose, our movements economical and swift. We dressed in layers, preparing for the cold morning air. Every sound seemed magnified in the stillness of the house. The soft rustle of fabric, the quiet zip of a duffel bag, the gentle click of my watch clasp. Each noise was a potential betrayal, a sound that could wake our captors and end our rebellion before it had even begun. Our worldly possessions had been reduced to what could fit in 2 small bags. Inside were a few changes of clothes, our essential documents, the small bundle of cash that was our entire life savings, and 1 small framed photo of a younger, happier David that Eleanor had slipped in when she thought I wasn't looking. It was a testament to a mother's undying love, even in the face of profound betrayal. With our bags in hand, we began our ascent from the basement. Moving up those stairs was like emerging from a tomb into a house that was no longer our home. It was a foreign territory, a landscape of painful memories and modern furniture that had displaced our own. We moved like shadows, our soft-soled shoes making no sound on the polished hardwood floors. The digital clock on the microwave glowed a stark 3:15 a.m. The house was cold and still breathing silently around us. We crept past the living room, past the ghostly silhouette of the white Italian chair that had replaced my old friend. And then we came to the hallway that led to the bedrooms. We paused. Down that hall behind two closed doors were the only things that still tied our hearts to this place. We stood for a long moment outside Jamal's door, and then Keisha's. My heart ached with a pain so deep it was almost physical. I could hear the faint, steady sound of their breathing. They were sleeping, dreaming innocent dreams, unaware that their grandparents were about to vanish from their lives. The urge to open the door, to look at their faces one last time, to kiss their foreheads, was almost overwhelming. But we couldn't. A single creaky floorboard, a sleepy murmur from one of them, and it would all be over. We were leaving them, and leaving them without a word of goodbye felt like the cruelest part of this whole affair. But I told myself that this act, this painful departure, was also for them. We could not let them grow up watching us be diminished, seeing their father complicit in our slow erasure. We had to leave to preserve whatever good memories they had of us. With heavy hearts, we continued to the kitchen. This was the final stop. Eleanor laid a single sheet of paper and a pen on the cold granite countertop. I picked up the pen. My hand, which had trembled with rage and helplessness just hours before, was now perfectly steady. My resolve had hardened into something unbreakable. I wrote just 2 simple sentences, the only message we could leave behind. We had to leave. Don't look for us. No explanation, no recrimination. There was nothing left to say. I placed the note in the very center of the kitchen island where it could not be missed. Then we walked to the front door. I looked at Eleanor, her face illuminated by the pale light of a street lamp outside. She nodded, her eyes clear and resolute. I turned the deadbolt, the soft click sounding like a gunshot in the silent house. I opened the door and a blast of cold, clean air hit my face. We stepped outside, pulling the door gently closed behind us. We didn't look back. The walk through the sleeping suburban streets was surreal. We were fugitives in the neighborhood we once considered a part of us. The fear was a cold knot in my stomach. We were in our 70s with a few $100s to our name and no destination. But woven through the fear was a powerful, exhilarating thread of freedom. For the first time in over a year, no one was watching us. No one was judging our choices or managing our lives. The crisp morning air felt like a baptism, washing away the oppressive, suffocating atmosphere of that house. As we walked, the sky in the east began to lighten from black to a deep, bruised purple. And in the distance we saw the faint, hazy glow of the bus station lights. It was a beacon, not of safety, but of possibility. It was the door to the rest of our lives. The bus station was a harsh, brightly lit purgatory. The air smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant, a sterile scent that did nothing to clean the feeling of desperation that seemed to cling to the hard plastic chairs. We were adrift in a sea of anonymous faces, people coming and going with clear destinations while we had none. We found a small bench in a corner and sat down, our 2 duffel bags at our feet, representing the sum total of our lives. I looked at the departures board, a flickering list of cities that felt as foreign as distant planets. Richmond, Atlanta, Baltimore. They were just names meaningless to 2 people who had only ever known one home. The adrenaline that had fueled our escape was beginning to fade, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion and the cold, terrifying reality of our situation. We were old, we were alone, and we were completely, utterly lost. We must have been a pitiful sight, 2 elderly people huddled together against the cold, our faces etched with a fear we could no longer hide. People rushed past us, their minds on their own journeys, and we became invisible, just another part of the station's bleak scenery. And then, a small miracle happened. A woman in a blue custodian's uniform was quietly mopping the floor nearby. She was probably in her 60s, her face a roadmap of a life that had not been easy, but her eyes were kind and observant. She didn't stare, but I could feel her gentle gaze on us as she worked. She finished her mopping, disappeared into a back room, and returned a few minutes later carrying 2 steaming styrofoam cups. She walked over to us and held them out. "You two look like you could use this," she said, her voice soft and warm. "It's a cold morning to be traveling. This should warm you up." We were so stunned by this simple act of generosity that for a moment neither of us could speak. I finally found my voice. "Thank you," I managed to say. "Thank you so much." She just gave us a small, knowing smile. "You take care of each other now," she said before turning and walking away. We never even learned her name. Her name was Brenda. We didn't learn her name, but Eleanor and I will never forget her. As I held the warm cup in my trembling hands, the heat seeping into my cold fingers, I felt something else too, a tiny flicker of warmth in my soul. After months of feeling like a burden, a stranger had seen us and had shown us a simple, unconditional kindness. As we were sipping the best coffee I had ever tasted, a large man in a trucker's cap approached us. He was built like a bear, and for a second I felt a flicker of apprehension. But his face was open and friendly. "Morning," he said with a deep, rumbling voice. "That coffee sure is a lifesaver on a day like today." We nodded in agreement. He looked at our small bags, then at our faces. "You folks heading somewhere special?" he asked casually. I gave a vague answer, something about heading north to see family. I was a poor liar, and I'm sure he saw right through it. He didn't press. He just took a sip of his own coffee and looked at the departure board. "Look," he said after a moment, turning back to us. "It's none of my business, but you two look a little bit lost. I'm Leroy. I'm driving my rig north on I-85 all the way past Virginia. If you're heading in that direction, I've got a warm cab and a smooth ride. It's a lot better than waiting in here for a bus to nowhere." Eleanor and I exchanged a look. Every instinct for self-preservation told us not to trust a stranger, not to get into a truck with a man we didn't know. But then I looked into his eyes and I saw the same simple, honest kindness we had just seen in the custodian's face. We had been betrayed by our own family. Perhaps it was time to put our faith in a stranger. "We'd be very grateful, Leroy," I said. The cab of his truck was a small, self-contained world, warm and smelling faintly of leather and coffee. It felt like a sanctuary. As the miles rolled by, Leroy talked. He told us about his wife, his kids in college, the funny things he'd seen on the road. He shared his lunch with us, thick sandwiches of ham and cheese that Eleanor and I devoured gratefully. He didn't ask us about our story. He just created a safe space for us to exist, to breathe, to begin to heal. His easy conversation and endless stream of stories about the good people he met in his travels were a balm to our wounded spirits. He was reminding us without ever saying it that the world was bigger than the cold, modern house we had just fled. He was reminding us that goodness still existed. Late in the afternoon, Leroy pulled off the main highway. "I know a place," he said, looking at us in his rearview mirror. "I've delivered goods there for 20 years, a little town called Havenwood. It's quiet, pretty off the beaten path. But more than that, it's full of decent folks. People still look out for each other there. It seems like the kind of place you might be looking for." He drove us into the heart of the small town and pulled up in front of a lovely little town square. He helped us with our bags and refused the money I tried to offer him. "You just pay it forward when you can," he said with a warm smile. "You take care now." And with a friendly wave, he was gone. We stood on the sidewalk of this unknown town, a place called Havenwood, no longer filled with fear, but with a fragile, tentative, and deeply precious sense of hope. We stood in the town square of Havenwood, two lost souls with two small bags, and watched as Leroy's truck disappeared down the road. The town was like something from an old postcard. A quiet main street was lined with brick buildings. A small park with a white gazebo sat in the center, and the air was clean and smelled of freshly cut grass. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, neither Eleanor nor I felt a sense of dread. Instead, there was a quiet, fragile sense of peace. But peace doesn't fill an empty stomach. We were exhausted, hungry, and had nowhere to go. Our eyes settled on the only place that seemed to be bustling with life, a cozy-looking diner on the corner with a simple sign that read Hattie's Place. We walked in, and the warm air, rich with the smell of coffee and frying bacon, enveloped us like a hug. A woman who looked to be in her late 60s stood behind the counter, commanding the room with a no-nonsense energy and a warm, genuine smile. This had to be Hattie. She took one look at us, at our weary faces and our small duffel bags, and seemed to understand everything without us saying a word. "You two look like you've been on the road for days," she said, her voice a comforting melodic drawl. Sit down, sit down. The meatloaf special is hot and ready." She didn't ask any questions. She just led us to a comfortable booth and a few minutes later placed 2 heaping plates of food in front of us. It was the most delicious meal I had ever eaten. It tasted like kindness. As we ate, Hattie came and sat with us. We didn't tell her the whole ugly story, just that we had left our previous situation and were looking for a fresh start. She listened patiently, her eyes full of a deep worldly wisdom. When we were finished, she looked at us and said, "Well, the good Lord works in mysterious ways. My tenant in the apartment upstairs just moved out last week. It's small, but it's clean, and it's quiet. You can have it for a fair price if you're interested." Eleanor and I looked at each other stunned. A home, a safe place. It was more than we had dared to hope for. That afternoon we moved into the small, cozy apartment above the diner. It was nothing like our grand old house and a world away from the cold basement we had just fled. It was small, it was simple, but it was ours. It was a sanctuary. We couldn't bear the thought of living on charity, so we immediately looked for ways to contribute. Eleanor noticed Hattie was often overwhelmed during the morning rush. "I can bake," Eleanor offered one morning. "My pies are pretty good." That was the understatement of the century. Hattie let her use the kitchen, and Eleanor baked an apple pie from her old family recipe. Hattie put a slice on the menu. By the end of the day, the entire pie was gone, and customers were asking when she would bake another. Soon Eleanor's pies became the talk of Havenwood. People would come from neighboring towns just to get a slice of her peach cobbler or her cherry pie. I saw a light return to my wife's eyes that I thought had been extinguished forever. She wasn't an old woman being told what to eat. She was an artist, a creator celebrated for her talent. Watching her find her joy, I knew I had to find mine too. Hattie's garage was cluttered with years of forgotten junk. I offered to clean it out for her. Tucked away in a corner under a dusty tarp was an old, sturdy workbench. Seeing my eyes light up, Hattie said, "You can use it if you want, Sam. It's just collecting dust." It was all I needed to hear. I started by fixing a few wobbly tables for the diner. Then a neighbor saw my work and asked if I could repair an antique rocking chair her grandmother had left her. Word spread. Soon I had a steady stream of work people bringing me their broken treasures, their family heirlooms. The feeling of shaping wood again, of restoring something broken to its former glory, was a powerful medicine for my soul. I wasn't a feeble old man who couldn't be trusted to drive. I was a craftsman, a restorer, a man with a skill that people valued. We were no longer isolated. We were part of something. Our neighbors in the building next door invited us over for dinner. We joined the local church and were welcomed into a community of kind, genuine people. We started attending the weekly card game at the senior center, where we were greeted by our first names, Samuel and Eleanor, not as the old folks or David's parents. People were interested in our stories and our lives. They valued our experiences. We were seen, we were heard, and we were respected. One evening, as Eleanor and I sat in our small living room, listening to the happy murmur of voices from the diner below, I realized something profound. We had lost a 5-bedroom house, but here in this tiny apartment, we had finally found a home. A year passed. Life in Havenwood settled into a gentle, comforting rhythm. We had our work, our friends, and our small, peaceful home. The sharp edges of our trauma had softened, replaced by a quiet sense of gratitude. We were happy. Then one Tuesday afternoon, as I was finishing a repair on an old rocking chair, a familiar-looking sedan pulled up in front of the diner. A man got out, and for a moment I didn't recognize him. He was thinner. His expensive suit hung loosely on his frame, and his face was etched with lines of exhaustion and a sorrow so profound it seemed to have aged him 10 years. It was our son David. He stood on the sidewalk looking uncertain, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked like a lost boy, not the confident architect I remembered. I put down my sanding block and walked slowly out of the garage. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel joy. I felt a deep, weary numbness. I called up to Eleanor, who was in the apartment, and she came down wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron. She saw him and stopped on the bottom step, her face unreadable. We stood there, a strange tableau on the quiet main street, facing the ghost of our former life. We didn't invite him into our home. Instead, we walked to a small bench in the town square. For a long time, no one spoke. Finally, David broke the silence, his voice rough and unfamiliar. "I'm sorry." He began the words, sounding small and inadequate in the open air. "I know those words are not enough. I know they probably mean nothing to you now, but I have to say them." He took a deep, shaky breath and looked at his hands, unable to meet our eyes. Your letter, your disappearance, it was like a bomb going off in my life. It destroyed everything, and I finally realized that I was the one who had lit the fuse. He told us everything. He and Monique were separated. He explained that after we left, the silence in the house became unbearable. Without us as a buffer and a target, Monique's manipulative nature had turned fully on him. He saw with horrifying clarity what he had allowed her to do, what he had been complicit in. I was a coward, he said, his voice cracking. I was so afraid of losing my comfortable life, so afraid of her anger that I let her poison everything. I let her hurt you. There is no excuse for what I did. There is no excuse for my silence. He told us he had been going to therapy for the past 6 months, trying to understand how he had become a man who would stand by and watch as his parents were systematically erased. And then he finally looked up at us, his eyes swimming with tears. I am not here to ask you to come back, he said, his voice breaking completely. I am not here to ask for anything. I just came to say that I am so sorry for what I did for the son I became. And I am asking with no right to expect it, if you can ever find it in your hearts to forgive me. He buried his face in his hands and his shoulders shook with deep, wrenching sobs. Eleanor and I sat in silence, letting his words and his tears settle between us. I looked at the man before me. This was not the weak, evasive son I remembered. This was a man broken and humbled, a man who had finally taken a long, hard look at his own soul and had been horrified by what he found. Eleanor, in her infinite wisdom, was the first to speak. Her voice was not angry, but it was not soft either. It was steady and clear. What about the children? David? How are Jamal and Keisha? He told us they missed us terribly, that they asked about us every single day. After another long silence, Eleanor spoke again, laying out the terms of our peace. We forgive you, David, she said. But forgiveness does not erase what happened. You need to understand, we are not coming back. Our life is here now. This is our home. I found my own voice backing her up with a strength I hadn't felt in years. You and the children are welcome to visit, I said, my gaze firm. But our relationship from now on will be built on honesty and respect, on our terms. That is the only way forward. A look of profound, heartbreaking relief washed over our son's face. He nodded, accepting our terms without a hint of argument. He knew he had no right to ask for more. That afternoon, for the first time in over a year, we invited our son into our home. We sat in our small, cozy kitchen and drank coffee. It was not a magical reunion that healed all wounds. The scars were still there. But it was a start. It was the beginning of a new kind of family, one built not on obligation or old habits, but on a painful, hard-won, and deeply precious foundation of truth. True family isn't about obligation or proximity. It's about respect. Dignity is not something that can be given or taken away by others. It is the home you build inside yourself, a foundation that no one can sell or claim. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation.